The bathtub was ordinary. The room was quiet. But when the door opened, she was gone. 3 women, 3 disappearances, each drowned alone. Each death ruled a tragic accident. And yet, something about these deaths didn't add up. No one noticed the pattern at first. No one suspected the man who offered an easy smile in the morning, shook hands with neighbors, and disappeared before the grief had even settled. What could make a home, a place of safety, into a trap? This is the story of the Brides in the Bath murders. Before the horror was understood, there were real lives, ordinary, hopeful, and quietly vulnerable. Bessie Mundy was 31 when she met the man who would become her husband. A widow with a modest inheritance held in trust, she lived a modest life by the sea in Herne Bay, tending her small garden each morning and often humming old songs as she arranged flowers on the windowsill. She harbored simple hopes of companionship and security in her later years, never imagining the danger that would come through her own front door. Alice Burnham, 25, was a trained nurse whose friends remembered her as warm and capable, careful with her finances, yet yearning for a life partner when she answered a suitor's letter in 1913. She often wrote in her diary about wanting someone to share Sunday walks along the pier, small moments of joy and hope she dreamed of sharing with a future husband. Margaret Elizabeth Lofty, 38, had recently married under an assumed name just days before her death in Highgate. Friends recalled her habit of leaving small, handwritten notes of encouragement for her students on the piano at the music school, a subtle testament to her care and dedication. To those who knew her, her life was marked by routines, work, friends, and small comforts, not by danger. None could have imagined that the very person they trusted most would betray them so completely. The first disappearance happened on an unremarkable July afternoon in 1912 in the seaside town of Herne Bay. Bessie Mundy, recently married and alone in her lodging, stepped into the bathtub and never came back out. When the doctor examined her body, there were no signs of violence. The coroner returned a verdict of death by misadventure, and her passing was written off as a tragic accident. A year later, in December 1913, Alice Burnham was found drowned in the bath of a rented room in Blackpool. Her life insurance and will had just been arranged in her husband's favor. Once again, no struggle, no witnesses, no explanation beyond another unfortunate mishap. Then, in December 1914, Margaret Lofty was discovered lifeless in her bathtub in Highgate, London, barely a day after her wedding. The circumstances were eerily familiar, yet even authorities wavered. Each husband slipped away without notice. Each death shared a chilling signature, and that was when things stopped making sense. When the first 2 deaths were ruled accidental, there was nothing to suggest a connection, just tragedy and unanswered questions. But what if these accidents were connected? What if someone had been hiding in plain sight all along? Once authorities began to pull on the thread that connected them, a far darker picture emerged. As the similarities grew impossible to ignore, investigators began looking closely at the one man who appeared in every story. At the center of the investigation was a figure who moved easily between identities. George Joseph Smith had married Bessie Mundy, Alice Burnham, and Margaret Lofty under different aliases: Henry Williams, John Lloyd, George Smith, respectively, each carefully chosen to avoid detection. To friends and neighbors, he appeared respectable, well-dressed, and unremarkable, a gentleman of Edwardian society. Few could have imagined that the same man who smiled in parlors and spoke gently could be capable of murder. But as detectives traced marriage records and interviewed witnesses, the similarities began to point unmistakably toward him. Money explained the motive, but it didn't explain the consistency. And it was that repetition that eventually drew investigators' attention. These were not chaotic deaths. Each followed a quiet courtship, a rapid marriage, financial arrangements that favored the husband, and then a drowning that appeared accidental. At first, each death stood alone, distant in time and place, handled by different coroners and ruled an unfortunate misadventure. But when the names, dates, and circumstances were finally compared, the similarities were striking. One accident might be misfortune. 3 begin to look like design. Investigators also began noticing subtle, almost imperceptible clues. The overlooked details linked the deaths together. In each case, the couple had taken lodgings with a private bathroom rather than shared facilities, unusual for the time. Smith had even insisted on inspecting bathtubs before agreeing to a room with Margaret Lofty. In all 3 cases, the victims were found fully clothed in narrow, high-sided tubs with no signs of struggle or visible violence. Bessie Mundy was discovered still clutching a bar of soap, a small, ordinary detail that reinforced the impression she had simply slipped. At the time, it seemed insignificant. Only later did it take on a far more unsettling meaning. The final piece of the puzzle was the timeline. The deaths spanned years and towns, each investigated separately, each dismissed as an accident. Bessie had died in Herne Bay in 1912, Alice in Blackpool in 1913, and Margaret in Highgate, London in 1914. Each husband had quietly left town, and each case had seemed isolated, until detectives began untangling a web of aliases, geography, and official rulings, discovering a pattern that suggested something far more deliberate than chance. Even before all the cases were fully reconstructed, investigators suspected design. They moved carefully but urgently, following leads across towns and records, aware that Smith might vanish before the full extent of his crimes could be proven. They pursued the connections without complete forensic certainty, driven by the chilling realization that these were not random tragedies. Just as motive, method, and opportunity started to overlap, a deeper question emerged. How could 3 healthy women drown in bathtubs without struggle or mark? It was this simple, terrifying question, previously unasked, that would lead investigators down an even darker path, into the mechanics and mind of a meticulous killer. Expert pathologists, including Home Office expert Sir Bernard Spilsbury, examined the evidence to understand not just that the women had drowned, but how such similar deaths could occur without signs of struggle or injury, something that baffled investigators. The bodies showed no bruises, legs often extended with heads submerged, and Bessie Mundy was found clutching a bar of soap, suggesting instantaneous unconsciousness rather than a gradual accident. To test this, Spilsbury proposed a reconstruction. Detective Inspector Arthur Neal arranged for a volunteer of similar build to enter a bathtub while police and a doctor observed. Pushing her under produced violent thrashing, proving a typical struggle would leave clear signs. Then, following Spilsbury's instructions, Neil grasped her ankles and pulled her legs upward from the foot of the tub. Her head slid beneath the surface before she could react. Water rushed in. She lost consciousness instantly and had to be lifted and revived. She later recalled only the sudden submersion and the instant everything went black. Spilsbury's reconstruction demonstrated how a person could be drowned quickly and without visible struggle in a narrow Edwardian bathtub. While the precise method may have varied in reports, the experiment later proved to the court that what might appear as misfortune could, in fact, be executed with deliberate precision and in the hands of George Joseph Smith, devastatingly effective. As the investigation deepened, detectives began to piece together not just a sequence of events, but a chilling portrait of the man at the center of it all. George Joseph Smith was not impulsive or erratic. He was organized, deliberate, and disturbingly meticulous. The drownings, investigators realized, had not emerged from nowhere. Long before the deaths in Herne Bay, Blackpool, and Highgate, Smith had built a life around deception. As a younger man, he drifted between towns under assumed names, targeting women through matrimonial advertisements and social introductions. He presented himself as respectable and dependable, whatever identity best suited the moment. He had prior convictions for theft and fraud, and served prison sentences for swindling women out of savings and valuables. Marriage, for Smith, was rarely about companionship. It was strategy. Even before 1912, he had entered into multiple marriages under aliases, often disappearing once money changed hands. In those earlier cases, deception had been enough. But deception carried risk. It left witnesses. It allowed victims to speak. For years, he moved between towns under new names, marrying, securing money, and vanishing. What tied his crimes together wasn't just method, but motive. Each of his victims had financial resources, and Smith made sure he benefited, securing wills or life insurance policies that named him as the principal beneficiary. The bathtub, detectives now believed, was not impulsive, it was refinement. He maintained a facade of normalcy, polite, calm, charming, the sort of man neighbors trusted without question. But beneath that calm smile, every step, every letter, every carefully timed move was part of a carefully constructed plan. Investigators, lacking eyewitnesses, eventually turned to patterns and forensic reconstruction, stitching together evidence that would expose not a series of accidents, but the culmination of a long, evolving criminal career. When the case finally reached court, the prosecution made a deliberate choice. They would not try to prove every death individually, but instead focus on Margaret Lofty's drowning as the clearest example of deliberate method. What would make this trial truly historic was how the other two deaths, Bessie Mundy in Herne Bay and Alice Burnham in Blackpool, were introduced not as unrelated tragedies, but as similar fact evidence, linking years, towns, and aliases into a single, inescapable narrative of calculation and intent. This was unusual for the time. British courts had rarely admitted evidence of prior events to establish a pattern of behavior. Yet the similarities were too striking to ignore. The rapid marriages, the shared method, the financial gains. The jury saw what chance could no longer explain. After a relatively short deliberation, George Joseph Smith was found guilty. On August 13, 1915, he was executed by hanging at Maidstone Prison, bringing an end to a case that had baffled authorities and haunted communities. But even as justice was served, a lingering unease remained. How many other dangers hide behind everyday routines? the horror of the brides in the bath murders was not only in the deaths themselves, but in how a seemingly ordinary man could conceal calculated cruelty in simple sight. Even after George Joseph Smith's conviction and execution, the impact of the brides in the bath case didn't disappear with him. That courtroom did more than convict a killer. It changed how justice recognizes intent. During Smith's trial, prosecutors introduced the deaths of his other wives not as unrelated tragedies, but as evidence of a repeating system of behavior. While the principle of similar fact evidence, sometimes referred to as the doctrine of chances, already existed in English law, the brides in the bath case became one of the most famous early examples of its application, showing how strikingly similar incidents could demonstrate that a defendant's claim of accident was highly improbable. For the legal world, it was a profound shift, a case that reshaped how evidence could be used when motive and method repeatedly pointed to one person. For the families and communities touched by the tragedy, there was no simple closure. They were left to grapple with the betrayal of trust in what should have been safe, private spaces, homes, bedrooms, bathtubs, and the chilling reality that a polite smile could conceal deadly intent. And even now, when we look back at the brides in the bath, one question lingers long after the final verdict. In the quiet corners of everyday life, how many dangers hide behind courtesy and charm? If stories like this spark your curiosity, we explore cases like this every week, from true crime and historical mysteries to hidden stories that challenge what we think we know. Subscribe and join the exploration. Thank you for watching.